Welcome back. This is part 5 of my video series, AngularJS and SharePoint. We are well into the second hour of my SharePoint Saturday 2019 presentation. We just finished looking at requests.html and requests.js. Now we're going to continue by looking at the 3 child HTML files: list.html, display.html, and edit.html. These child forms are swapped in and out by the router, and they are the bulk of the HTML controls, what makes the application look the way it does. Let's get started. All right, this is the list.html page that we're seeing here. We can enter in a search criteria. We can select different views. We can start a new request. And as you see here, we have the UI grid. And if you click on the header cells, you can sort each category. Here, if we click on one of the titles for one of our requests, we open up the display page. You notice that we have, for each field, we have the name of the field and then we have the data. And it's nicely organized in a form. It looks a lot more user-friendly than the out-of-the-box SharePoint edit item would look, or display item would look like. So we can arrange this any way we want. This is basically a table, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. And here we go to the edit, and now it's quite similar. We have our request ID again is read-only because we can't change it, so it's going to be shown to us. We can choose a department or a category from the drop-down. We can type in a justification and so on. Now, this is a very simple version. Any user can make changes to any of the controls. We kept it simple for the sake of a demo, but in a real application, you would have business logic that says, well, if the current user is not a member of this group, I'm not going to let him edit the technician, and so forth. Also, here's our date picker we talked about previously. Is very nice. And you can customize that to look the way you want. We're going to go ahead and save it. Notice we're saving. We go back to the display. And finally, let's go to new request. Notice we have a title, department, category, justification, status is submitted. The user can't change anything else because this is a new request. Finally, we select one of our requests. We click edit. And then we click delete, and we get a pop-up saying, do you want to delete this request, okay or not? And if we delete it, it would delete it from the list. That's all the functionality, and let's go ahead and take a look at the HTML files. Here is list.html. It's a standard table, and if you look here, you will notice that we have a reference to a variable from our controller. This is vm.warning. If you recall from the routing, we defined aliases for our controller so we don't have to type them out. I've adopted the VM abbreviation for all of my controllers. I call them all VM. It just makes the code easier to work with. VM comes from view model. It's a standard that I picked up from one site I was looking at or another, and I liked it, so I stick with it. But all you have to do in your controller is to refer to, just name a variable as vm.something, and that becomes immediately available in your HTML as well. So if something happens in the processing of the code and you fire up a warning, then this H2 tag will be visible and it will show the VM warning value. The other interesting thing that AngularJS offers is you can, if you have a text box, for example, and the model of the text box is linked to VM warning, if you change that value in the HTML, it immediately changes it everywhere it exists in the JS file as well. It's kind of a different way of looking at the relationship between the HTML and the JS. Variables are live and real time in both places. So you can change a variable by changing a drop down or typing something into a text box, and there can be code in the JS or other controllers on your HTML that immediately react to the change of a variable. So where you normally would have to use a lot of click events and capturing things that happen by simply using variables, you're able to effect changes to the state throughout all of your application. It's quite a different way of doing business. Down here, we see the grid. This is all it takes to define our grid. We have CSS involved and all, but basically the grid is very powerful, and I'm just using the UI grid that you're able to download, and it does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. All you really need to do is focus on the CSS and get it to look the way you want, and then you simply populate the column definitions and say, this is the content I want to show, and the grid displays it for you. It's very nice. So not a lot else to the list page. I have more to show you in the display and the edit pages. So let's go on to those. Here is our display.html page. As you see here, we have a lot more of our variables. So here's request ID and vm.requestID. Again, the double curly brackets simply says show that variable to the user. And there's not a lot else to show. We're basically using a table with TRs and TDs. So the display is pretty straightforward. Here is the edit.html file. As you see, it's also using a table, much like the display. I want to show a typical text box. This is the title text box. We're using an input tag, and we are using an attribute called ngModel, which assigns VM title as the variable that's married to this text box. As I mentioned earlier, if you edit VM title in this text box, anywhere that VM title exists in the JS or the HTML, it instantly takes effect and changes. So a lot of things you need event handlers to enable. You just simply look at the values as they are when either the JS or the HTML. I wanted to talk about ngShow and ngHide. Basically, ngShow and ngHide are attributes that will show or hide a control in HTML based on a value that we get from our controller. So if VM new is true, we're going to hide request ID, because the user doesn't need to see request ID for a new request. This can be any combination, any sort of formula that resolves to true or false. One thing to keep in mind is that you can't use ngShow and ngHide together on the same control. Choose one or the other, and if you find yourself using a lot of negatives, then switch from show to hide, because you want to keep your formula as simple as possible. Now I want to show you one of the combo boxes. The simplest type of combo box is here. This is the status. Notice that we have ngModel. Again, this is the property that is passed back and forth to our controller. So we're setting VM status, which is a string. So we have a very simple ng options attribute, item for item in VM statuses. VM statuses is a collection of strings. Item is a string, so we're just saying item for item. Now we can contrast that with, say, technician right here. Technician is a lookup. So technician ID is a number, which is what SharePoint is storing. And our ng options looks a little more involved. We're still pulling from a collection, VM technicians. Item is the individual element in technicians, and we're getting item ID as item.title. ID is a number, that's the value that we're storing back to technician ID, and then title is the string that we're showing to the user. So that is how you would use a object, a collection of objects in a drop-down. You set what the value is and you set what the display is to the user. Finally, the dates. As I mentioned, we have the date picker attribute that we simply assign to an input box, and that lets us have the date drop-down. Here is the request.list.js file. Notice at the top we have our definition of our controller. We are importing several modules. You see we have Q, HTTP, and so forth. The first time we reference them, we're using double quotes. The second time inside of the function, we don't use any quotes. The only thing I ask you to keep in mind, you can put these in any order you want, but marry them up so you're declaring them in the same order. So that way, in case you're missing one, it's easy to go back and say, oh, you can see them next to each other and you're missing one. So in a class like any controller or service, Angular will run the code in the order in which it sees it, but it will ignore functions. So I put all my functions at the top, and then my events, and then I put all of the code that I want to run at the bottom of the class. So I'm just going to step through the entire class here and just touch on each function briefly to tell you what it does. You'll need to explore each of them on your own. Get fields makes a REST API call to the list to get all of the fields and puts them in a collection. Get results is fed a URL and it calls HTTP. It's calling our REST API, excuse me, and passes in the URL that's fed to it. It takes the results and it populates an item collection and then returns that item collection. Get view gets all of the views for the current list and populates VM views and determine what's the current title, either by the view title that's passed in, which comes from the view dropdown, or if a user hasn't selected one, like when we first come into the form, then we're going to assign the default view. So this is how we determine which view to use when making our call to the REST API. Set grid results is a method that we use to populate our grid. You can see the definition here of VM grid results and then the two curly brackets that define it. And then we're setting two properties, data and column defs. Data is VM items, which is our collection of items that we got from the REST. And then column defs, we're setting two columns. It's a collection of columns, and that tells the grid what it's displaying. The column definitions say what the columns are, and then the data provided, it loops through at runtime and displays each item in the grid based on the columns we've defined. So we always have request ID and title. Note that I'm using a cell template in order to make a link, and then the link is going to show pound display and the ID, and then the text shown to the user is the title. That's how we make our link in the grid. And then we loop through the rest of the view fields, whatever is left in the view that's not request ID and not title, and we make columns for those as well. Show error is a method that I have in both my list and my item controller, and it's a standardized way of displaying any errors that occur. VM warning is a banner that's shown to the user. It's the user-friendly version of the error, and then console error writes the stack and what other useful information to the console, so you can go in and see more details about the error. Show results is going to populate. It's going to pull in the views and the view fields, and it's going to create a URL that gets passed to get results. Notice here that we're looking at all of the views to determine if they are Boolean, date, time, user, whatever. That's going to make a user-friendly output for each of our fields that aren't straight up text. And here we're building our URL, and we're using XML to get the view query. Basically, this is just going to build the REST URL that we're passing to get results. And now here we come down to the actual calling of get results. One thing you want to take note of is if we have a search criteria, we're going to call get results and we're passing in a URL. SharePoint REST will return all of the fields in a list that you ask it for, and you can filter your results by certain fields. However, REST does not support filtering multi-line text fields. So in order to get around this, I have to return all of the results, and then in here I am applying my own search. I'm basically building a full text string that's basically it's all of the text in that current row, putting it together, and then leaving out certain ones, like if it's a date, time, or a Boolean, we're not including those. And we're searching against that full text line. And then if it matches, then we're pushing that to the result to VM item. So basically, I'm doing the search within my code because REST does not support searching multi-line fields. If we don't have any search, it's much more straightforward. We're simply calling get results. We're taking each result and we're pushing it to the VM items collection. Now, filter change is an event that is fired whenever the user does anything in the list page that's going to cause us to redraw the grid. So if they start typing in any search criteria, if they change the views, if I have other drop downs, let's say I'm filtering by department or something, all of those triggers would call filter change because they all do the same thing. They call show results, which then recalculates the results, and then call set grid results, which then populates the grid. Finally, we have command new, which is going to redirect to the new page. All right, this concludes part 5 of my series, AngularJS and SharePoint. In the next section, part 6, we will wrap things up with the request.items.js file, which is the largest file, and that will end our series. See you then.